If anyone had told Maggie at 72 that she'd be spilling a tale of cheating, yearning, and forbidden love, she'd have laughed in their face, right there on Fifth Avenue. 72 was supposed to be Central Park strolls, predictable days, and zero drama. Retirement with Bill, her husband of decades, should have been all cozy evenings and familiar routines. But life, Maggie learned the hard way, throws curveballs harder than a Brooklyn Dodgers pitcher in their prime. Maggie and Bill, 40 years married. He was a good man, everyone said so. Smart, hardworking, loyal, a history professor even after retiring. Young Maggie had been smitten with his sharp mind and dry wit, his ambition like a beacon. But time, that sneaky thief, had turned those very traits into walls between them. Bill was always more at home in a book than a room full of people, even after hanging up his professor hat. He'd lock himself in his study in their Upper West Side apartment, writing papers nobody asked for, chasing academic glory that had long since faded. Maggie? She filled her days alone. Books, the small garden on their balcony, lunch with friends when she could manage it. But the silence in their apartment, in their marriage, was deafening. No kids, by choice or maybe just by drifting apart. Bill had a son, Mike, from his first marriage, a charming ghost in their lives, always moving, always calling from somewhere else. Then last spring, Mike, now 38, fresh off a divorce, showed up at their Riverside Drive door, suitcase in hand, looking like a kicked puppy, needed a place to crash while he got back on his feet. Bill, ever the practical one, welcomed him in without a second thought. At first, Maggie was almost happy for the company. Mike was a shot of espresso in their beige life, filling their quiet apartment with laughter and stories. Kind, attentive, alive, things Maggie hadn't realized she'd been starving for. But weeks turned into months, and the easy camaraderie with Mike morphed into something else, something hotter, something dangerous. Maggie never intended to betray Bill, never thought she was even capable of it. But the heart, that tricky muscle, was desperate for a spark, for something more than the quiet ache of loneliness that had become her life. What happened next was a blur of guilt, desire, pure exhilaration, and then the inevitable crash. A decision that blew up her life. If you're willing to listen, Maggie will tell you everything, every stolen moment, every mistake, every gut-wrenching consequence. Because if nothing else, her story proves that life, even at 72 in Manhattan, still knows how to deliver a punch. Maggie was 25, a librarian at NYU when she met Bill, a young history professor. He was unlike any guy she'd ever known. Brilliant, intense, utterly consumed by his work. She was hooked instantly, captivated by his brain, by the quiet confidence that radiated off him like heat from a summer sidewalk. Married 2 years later, Maggie thought she'd found her New York fairy tale. Bill was driven, always striving for the next academic peak, and Maggie was proud to be his rock. She managed their life, went to his lectures, hosted stuffy faculty dinners in their cramped village apartment, all while keeping her own job at the library. Busy, yes, but fulfilling. The cracks started showing later when Bill's career took off. His attention to Maggie dwindled. Work, work, work. Long hours at the university, longer hours locked away in his study at home. Maggie tried to be understanding, telling herself it was his brilliance, his dedication. But year after year, the distance grew. A chasm wider than the Hudson. Retirement, she'd hoped, would be different. More time for them. Wrong. Retirement just widened the gap. Bill traded his university office for his home study, disappearing into research and writing. Building a legacy, he called it, like the world would forget him if he didn't leave behind one last earth-shattering book. Maggie's days became a silent film. Gardening on the balcony, reading, the occasional lunch with friends. Loneliness. A constant roommate in their spacious but empty apartment. The place, once full of life and laughter, felt like a mausoleum, echoing with ghosts of a life that wasn't hers anymore. She'd replay what-ifs in her head. What if she'd chased her own career instead of playing supportive wife? What if she'd pushed for kids despite Bill's lukewarm response? What if she'd married someone who looked at her the way Bill used to, with fire in his eyes? But life in New York, or anywhere, doesn't offer do-overs. Maggie had made her choices, or maybe just drifted into them, made peace, or so she thought. Then Mike showed up on a rainy Tuesday that felt like the city itself was weeping. He stood there, soaked, defeated, holding a suitcase and a half-empty bottle of something brown. His usual swagger gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made Maggie's chest ache. "Hey, Maggie," he'd said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if I come in?" She pulled him inside, took his wet coat, offered tea. Bill, of course, was in his study, oblivious. Just Maggie and Mike in the kitchen, steam rising from their mugs. Divorce, Mike explained. A messy explosion of infidelity and lawyers leaving him broke and emotionally gutted. Needed a place to land while he figured things out. Bill, when he finally emerged from his study, was surprisingly agreeable. Guest room was ready, stay as long as you need. Maggie was relieved, not just to help Mike, but for the jolt of life he brought into their quiet apartment, a welcome break from the monotony. At first, Mike's presence was easy, a breath of fresh air. Charming, funny, always a kind word. He filled the apartment with energy, with warmth, and Maggie found herself actually looking forward to their conversations. Books, movies, his vague plans for the future. He even helped her on the balcony garden, pruning roses, pulling weeds, making her laugh. But as weeks bled into months, something shifted, the way Mike looked at her, his eyes lingering a beat too long when he thought she wasn't watching, the way his smile seemed to brighten when she walked into a room. And then, the accidental touches, hands brushing while reaching for the same book, a fleeting touch on her arm as he passed by. Small sparks, but they sent jolts of electricity through her. Maggie tried to dismiss it as her imagination, a lonely mind reading too much into nothing. But the truth was, she felt something when she was with Mike, something she hadn't felt in decades. One night, after Bill retreated to his study, Mike and Maggie found themselves alone in the living room, a bottle of wine open between them. Talking. Really talking, for the first time in years. The conversation drifted deeper, and before she knew it, Maggie was saying things she hadn't even admitted to herself. "I feel invisible," she whispered, voice barely audible above the city hum outside. "Like I'm just existing. Like I'm not even a person anymore." Mike reached out, took her hand. "You're not invisible, Maggie," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You're incredible, and anyone who can't see that is a fool." She looked into his eyes and saw something there that mirrored her own yearning, a raw desire. In that moment, she knew she wasn't imagining things. That night, something shifted, something that could never be undone. Mike's words echoed in her head long after she went to bed. "You're incredible, a fool." Not just the words, but the way he said them, with such conviction, such sincerity, it cracked something open inside her. Hours she lay awake, replaying the moment, the warmth of his hand, the intensity in his eyes, feeling truly seen for the first time in years. It was intoxicating. The days that followed were thick with tension. Maggie and Mike moved around each other like dancers in a dangerous ballet, caught in an unspoken pact. They didn't talk about that night, but the air between them thrummed with anticipation. It was only a matter of time before the tension snapped. A quiet Thursday evening, Bill was at some academic dinner downtown, leaving Maggie and Mike alone in the apartment. Maggie was in the kitchen, making pasta, when Mike walked in, hair damp from a shower, sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. "Smells good," he said, leaning against the counter, flashing that boyish smile. "Just pasta," Maggie managed, trying to keep her voice steady. He moved closer, so close she could feel his body heat. "Can I help?" She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The air crackled. Then, before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "Mike, what are we doing?" His smile faltered. For a second, she thought he'd back away. Instead, he reached out, gently brushed a stray hair from her face. "I don't know," he admitted, voice low. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Maggie's breath hitched. "This is wrong," she whispered, heart hammering. "Maybe," he said, voice even lower, "but it doesn't feel wrong." And then he kissed her. Tentative at first, like he expected her to pull away, but she didn't. The kiss deepened, urgent, desperate, his hands on her waist pulling her closer. Maggie melted into him, all her fears, all her doubts, drowned out by the sheer force of the moment. They didn't even make it to the bedroom that first time. It happened right there in the kitchen, the world outside fading to nothing as they gave in to the passion that had been simmering for weeks. After that night, there was no turning back. Maggie and Mike fell into a pattern of stolen moments, secret rendezvous, always careful, always waiting for Bill to be out, or locked away in his study. Risky, thrilling, the fear of getting caught only fueling the fire. But it wasn't just sex. They talked for hours, sharing secrets, hopes, fears. Mike told her about the wreckage of his divorce, the feeling of failure, the fear of starting over. Maggie told him about the loneliness that had become her shadow, the emptiness that had swallowed her marriage whole. With Mike, she felt alive again, vibrant. He made her laugh, made her feel desired, made her believe she was worth more than the quiet resignation that had become her life. But with every stolen moment of joy came a tidal wave of guilt. She couldn't look at Bill without feeling the weight of her betrayal. He trusted her completely, never questioned her loyalty, her love, and here she was, sleeping with his son, under his own roof. She tried to justify it, told herself Bill had pushed her away, made her invisible, but deep down, she knew it was just a lie. What she was doing was wrong, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the consequences. The breaking point came one evening when Bill came home early. Mike and Maggie were in the living room, a little too close on the couch, laughter echoing around them. The second Bill walked in, the air changed. His eyes flicked between them, suspicion hardening his gaze. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. "Nothing," Maggie said too quickly, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Just talking." Bill didn't say anything, but the look he gave her was like ice. Things got even more complicated after that. Maggie felt like she was walking a tightrope, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the fall. Mike tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't deny the danger. "We'll be careful," he'd whisper in the dark, their bodies tangled together. "Nobody has to know." But secrets, Maggie knew, have a way of surfacing. They fester, grow heavier until they're impossible to carry. Weeks turned into a blur of tension, guilt gnawing at her with every glance at Bill, with every stolen kiss from Mike. She was a thief, stealing moments of joy that didn't belong to her. Every time she looked at Bill's trusting face, guilt clawed at her insides, but she couldn't stop. Mike and Maggie were caught in a dangerous dance of stolen moments. A kiss in the hallway when Bill was in his study. Whispered words late at night when Bill was asleep. Exhilarating, intoxicating, but unsustainable. It was only a matter of time. And then, one evening, it happened. Bill had been invited to give a lecture at Columbia, a rare event. Maggie assumed he'd be out for hours, giving her and Mike a false sense of security. Living room, couch, close together. Mike's arm around her, Maggie leaning into him. A fleeting moment of peace. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," she murmured, voice laced with longing and dread. Mike's fingers traced circles on her arm. "I don't want to stop," he said, voice husky. "I can't stop." Before she could answer, the sound of the front door slamming open echoed through the apartment. Panic ripped through Maggie. She jumped up, putting space between herself and Mike in a split second. Too late. Bill stood in the doorway, face a mask of confusion, then dawning horror. "What's going on here?" he demanded, voice low, dangerous. "Nothing," Maggie stammered, heart hammering against her ribs. "We were just talking." Bill's eyes darted between them, narrowing, realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Talking," he repeated, tone dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you call it?" Mike stood, a mix of guilt and defiance on his face. "Dad, it's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," Bill's voice cracked like a whip, silencing them both. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the mantelpiece. Then, with a shaky breath, Bill turned to Maggie. "How long?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. Maggie opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain weeks of betrayal, of choices she never thought she'd make? "Doesn't matter," Bill said, answering his own question. "You've already said enough." The days after were a blur of shouting, accusations, tears. Bill confronted her again and again, demanding answers she didn't have. Why? How? Wasn't she happy? Did she ever even love him? "I don't know," Maggie sobbed one night, voice raw. "I don't know why it happened. I felt so alone." "Alone?" Bill's voice was heavy with disbelief. "You think I wasn't alone too? You think I haven't sacrificed things for this marriage?" Maggie had no answer. How could she argue? He was right. Mike tried to reach out, but Maggie couldn't face him. The weight of what they'd done was crushing. She avoided him, retreated to her bedroom, locked the door when he was home. Eventually, Mike left. "I can't stay here anymore," he said one morning, suitcase packed, standing by the door. "This isn't fair to any of us." Maggie nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So am I," he said. And then he was gone. Just Maggie and Bill, left with the wreckage of their 40-year marriage. Picking up the pieces was brutal. Decades of trust, shattered, replaced by a chasm of betrayal, resentment, counseling at Bill's insistence. Maggie was skeptical, but those sessions became a lifeline. Forced them to confront the rot that had been eating away at their marriage for years. The emotional distance, the lack of words, the unspoken disappointments. I felt invisible, Maggie confessed in one session, tears streaming down her face. Like I didn't matter anymore. Bill looked at her, his own eyes glistening. And I felt like I was losing you, he admitted, but I didn't know how to fix it. Painful, yes, but also clarifying. They started to see each other not as the perfect couple they'd once pretended to be, but as flawed, vulnerable humans trying to navigate the messy maze of life and love. Months later, a letter arrived for Maggie, from Mike. Maggie, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I needed to say something. I'm sorry for everything. The pain, the mess I made, never meant for any of it to happen. But I don't regret the time we shared. You made me feel alive again, and for that, I'll always be grateful. New city, new job, not easy, but I'm trying to rebuild. Hope you and Dad can find a way forward. You both deserve happiness. Take care, Mike. Maggie read it twice, folded it carefully, tucked it away. Bittersweet reminder of what was lost, but also what she'd learned. Months of reflection, of slow rebuilding. Counseling continued. Slowly, painstakingly, they pieced their marriage back together. Not perfect. Setbacks, arguments, doubts. But they were both committed to trying. One evening, sitting in the living room, Bill reached for her hand. I don't know if we'll ever be the same, he said, voice quiet. But I want to keep trying. Maggie squeezed his hand, a flicker of hope in her chest. So do I, she said. Not a fairy tale ending, not the one she'd imagined at 25, but real. And for that, she was grateful. Looking back, no, she wasn't proud of her choices, but she understood them. Loneliness, she learned, can drive you to places you never thought you'd go. Love is messy, complicated, not always enough to sustain a marriage, not always enough to prevent mistakes. But sometimes, just sometimes, it's enough to inspire forgiveness, growth, a second chance. And for that, Maggie would always be grateful.